The evening light fades slowly beyond the windows, the sky shifting through shades of deepening blue and violet as the sun completes its daily descent beyond the horizon. This is the twilight hour, the gentle transition between day and night, when the world softens at its edges and the harshness of daylight gives way to something more forgiving, more contemplative. The curtains hang at the windows, filtering what remains of the fading light, and beyond them the sky continues its slow transformation from blue to indigo to the first hints of true darkness. Inside, the house grows gradually quieter, the sounds of the day dissolving one by one until what remains is only the essential silence, the baseline hum of a home settling into evening. The television has been turned off, or perhaps it plays softly in another room, voices and music reduced to background murmur that barely registers in conscious awareness. The tasks of the day have been completed or abandoned, dishes washed or left for morning, doors locked, lights turned off in rooms that will not be entered again until tomorrow. There is no rush now, no urgency pressing forward, only the natural progression toward night and the rest it promises. The body begins its slow migration toward the bedroom, toward the bed that has become more than just furniture, that has become a sanctuary, a place of retreat and restoration. Muscles that have carried weight all day anticipate the release that comes with lying down, with allowing the mattress to support what the legs and back have been supporting since morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, as the twilight deepens outside and the house settles into its evening rhythm, allow yourself to begin the transition from the external world to the internal one, from the demands of the day to the quiet reflection that night permits. This is the time when the boundary between outer and inner becomes permeable, when thoughts that were kept at bay by activity and obligation begin to surface, when memory and contemplation claim the space that action and responsibility occupied just hours ago. The day releases its hold and the night extends its invitation, and somewhere between the two exists this liminal space, this twilight zone where neither completely dominates, where both coexist in gentle balance. The stillness that descends with twilight is different from the stillness of midnight, softer somehow, less complete, still holding traces of the day that was rather than being entirely claimed by the night that is becoming. It is a transitional quiet, a gradual rather than sudden silence, and in that gradualness there is comfort, a gentleness that allows for adjustment rather than demanding immediate surrender. The house makes its subtle sounds, the small noises that mark the passage from day to night, the cooling of walls that absorbed heat during daylight hours and now release it slowly, the settling of floorboards and the tick of cooling appliances, the almost imperceptible creaks and sighs that are so familiar they register as part of the silence rather than as interruptions of it. The air itself feels different as evening progresses, cooler against the skin if windows are open, still holding warmth if they are closed, but changed from what it was at midday, softer, easier to breathe, carrying the particular quality that belongs to this hour and no other. Outside, if one listens carefully, the sounds of evening emerge, different from the sounds of day, birds settling for the night, insects beginning their nocturnal songs, the distant hum of traffic diminishing as people complete their journeys and arrive at destinations where they too will settle into evening routines. This stillness is not empty but full, not an absence but a presence, a quality of silence that feels safe rather than lonely, peaceful rather than isolating. It is as if the quiet itself gives permission for the mind to slow, for thoughts to surface that have been submerged during the busy hours, for feelings to be acknowledged that had to be set aside when there were things to be done and people to interact with and roles to perform. The twilight stillness wraps around like a blanket, not heavy but present, not confining but protective, creating a space where it is possible to simply be without doing, to exist without producing, to rest without guilt. This is the gift that evening brings, this permission to stop, to turn inward, to allow the machinery of daily life to power down and the deeper rhythms of self to become audible again. And in that stopping, in that turning inward, there is relief, a gentle exhale that the body has been waiting all day to release, a softening of shoulders that have been held tense, a loosening of jaw that has been clenched without awareness, a letting go that happens naturally when the circumstances finally allow for it. The body that prepares now for bed is a body that has traveled far, not just through the hours of this particular day but through decades of days, through seasons and years that have accumulated like sediment until they formed the landscape of a long life. This body is 60 or more years old, or 70 or 80, marked by time in ways both visible and invisible, shaped by the life it has lived, bearing the evidence of all it has carried and endured and experienced. It is tired now, genuinely tired in ways that go deeper than the simple fatigue of a day's activities, tired with the accumulated weariness of years, but it is a familiar tiredness, one that has become as much a part of daily experience as breath or heartbeat. There are aches, yes, small pains that announce themselves when rising from a chair or climbing stairs or reaching for something on a high shelf, stiffness in joints that used to move fluidly but now require warming up, muscles that protest efforts they once performed without complaint. But these discomforts are not met with surprise or resistance anymore. They are simply acknowledged as part of what it means to inhabit this body at this stage of life, expected and accepted rather than fought against or resented. Movement has become slower, more intentional, less automatic than it was in youth when the body obeyed instantly and completely without need for conscious direction. Now there is negotiation, a checking in with various parts before attempting certain actions, a cautious testing before committing full weight or force, an awareness of limitation that youth never possessed because limitation had not yet made itself known. Steps are placed more carefully, balance is attended to with more awareness, transitions from sitting to standing or lying to sitting are accomplished with more attention and often with the assistance of hands pressing on armrests or mattress edges for support. This is not weakness but wisdom, the body's accumulated knowledge protecting itself from harm, moving in ways that minimize risk, that acknowledge vulnerability without being controlled by fear. And alongside the aches and limitations, there is gratitude, perhaps not articulated or even fully conscious, but present nonetheless, gratitude for this body that has carried life through so many years, that has served despite inadequate care or excessive demands, that has recovered from illness and injury, that continues to function well enough to allow for independence and dignity and the basic activities that make life livable. The relationship with the body has changed over the decades, from taking it for granted to fighting against its changes to finally, now, accepting it as it is, working with it rather than against it, treating it with the respect and care it has earned through its long service. The mind, however, refuses the body's readiness for rest, continues its activity even as muscles relax and breathing slows and all the physical signs of approaching sleep make themselves known. This is the paradox of aging, the tired body and the wakeful mind, the one ready to shut down and the other still running, still processing, still turning over thoughts and memories and observations as if daylight hours provided insufficient time for all the thinking that needs to be done. It is not anxiety that keeps the mind active, or at least not the sharp anxiety of worry or fear, but rather a gentle wandering, a drifting through the landscape of memory and reflection that seems to be the mind's natural activity when freed from external demands. Thoughts arise without invitation, memories surface without being summoned, questions present themselves without urgency for answers, and all of it flows at a pace that is contemplative rather than agitated, observational rather than judgmental. This is simply what the mind does now in these quiet hours, and fighting against it seems both futile and unnecessary, so instead there is acceptance of this wakefulness, this mental activity that will eventually exhaust itself and give way to sleep but which for now asks only to be allowed its wandering. There is no rush, no deadline, no place to be, and so the mind can take its time, can meander through whatever territory it chooses without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. Thinking has become a habit, perhaps even a comfort, a way of keeping company with oneself in the silence, of processing and integrating and making sense of the accumulated experience of a long life. It is not a problem to be solved, this wakefulness, not a disorder requiring treatment, but simply the way things are, the pattern that has established itself over years, and there is peace in accepting it rather than fighting it, in allowing the mind its nighttime wanderings while the body rests, in trusting that sleep will come eventually as it always does, perhaps later than desired but reliably nonetheless. And in the meantime, in these twilight hours between waking and sleeping, there is space for reflection, for the gentle review of the life that has been lived, for looking back not with judgment but with the compassionate witnessing that only comes with age and experience and the softening that time brings to harsh edges. Looking back from this vantage point, from the perspective of 60 or more years lived, the view is different from what it was at 30 or 40 or even 50. The night brings its own particular perspective, a softening of judgment, a loosening of the need to defend or justify or explain. In darkness, with only memory and thought for company, it becomes possible to see the whole arc of a life without being caught in the details, to witness rather than to judge, to observe the story that has unfolded without needing to deliver a verdict on whether it was done well or poorly, successfully or unsuccessfully. The harsh critic that lives in daylight, that compares and measures and finds lacking, grows quieter as the light fades, and what remains is something gentler, more accepting, more willing to see context and limitation alongside choice and agency. Life from this perspective appears not as a series of tests passed or failed but as a journey undertaken with whatever resources were available at the time, a navigation through terrain that offered no map, a response to circumstances that were often beyond control. The mistakes that seemed unforgivable at the time they were made soften when seen in the context of the whole life, revealed as part of learning rather than as permanent marks of failure, as moments in a long story rather than as the defining chapters. This looking back is not about rewriting history or excusing harm done or pretending things were other than they were, but about seeing with compassion, about extending to oneself the understanding that would be offered to a friend who confessed the same struggles and failures. The story is what it is, the life was lived as it was lived, and from this twilight perspective it becomes possible to hold all of it, the good and the bad, the wise and the foolish, the generous and the selfish, without needing any of it to be different from what it was. There is freedom in this acceptance, a release from the exhausting work of maintaining a narrative of either complete success or complete failure, an honesty that allows for complexity, for contradiction, for the reality that human lives contain multitudes and cannot be reduced to simple judgments. And so the mind wanders through memory not as prosecutor or defense attorney but as witness, observing what was, acknowledging what is, allowing the story to be told without needing to control the telling or predetermine the meaning. Childhood returns in these twilight memories, softened by decades of distance, the rough edges worn smooth by time until what remains is essence rather than detail, feeling rather than fact. The childhood homes appear, not necessarily as they actually were but as they felt, as they exist in the archive of memory which records sensation and emotion more faithfully than it records objective reality. The evening light in those homes, slanting through windows at particular angles, creating pools of gold on floors or walls, illuminating dust motes that floated in the beams like tiny galaxies. The smells of evening meals being prepared, whatever particular foods marked that household in that era, scents that are no longer encountered in daily life but which live on in memory with perfect fidelity, capable even now of evoking the feeling of being small and safe and belonging to something larger than oneself. The sounds of those evenings, parents moving through their routines, voices carrying from room to room, the particular acoustics of those spaces that made every house sound different from every other house. The feeling of safety that came with routine, with knowing what would happen next, with being surrounded by people and spaces that felt permanent, that seemed like they would exist forever unchanged, that created the illusion that the world was stable and secure and would always provide shelter. Parents as they were then, not as they became later or as they are remembered from adult perspective, but as they existed to a child's awareness, large and powerful and mysterious, possessing knowledge and capability that seemed magical, making decisions and taking actions whose full significance could not be understood but which created the framework within which childhood unfolded. They were younger then than the person remembering is now, a fact that brings strange recognition. Seeing them across the distance of decades and realizing they were navigating their own challenges, carrying their own burdens, doing their best with their own limitations, not the all-knowing authorities they appeared to be but human beings struggling and trying and sometimes failing just as everyone does. The world that surrounded childhood felt permanent in ways that nothing has felt permanent since, as if those streets and houses and routines were fixed features of reality rather than temporary configurations that would eventually dissolve and be replaced by other streets and houses and routines. That permanence was illusion but it was necessary illusion, providing the stability needed for growth, the security needed for the slow work of becoming a person, And even now, knowing it was illusion, the memory of that feeling of permanence brings comfort, a reminder of what safety felt like before the knowledge of impermanence arrived and changed everything. School years follow childhood in the procession of memory, those years of gradual awakening to the larger world beyond family, to the existence of society with its rules and hierarchies and expectations. The classrooms return in memory, the particular quality of light coming through institutional windows, the smell of chalk or markers or old books, the sound of voices in hallways and cafeterias, the feeling of sitting at desks hour after hour while teachers delivered information in voices that sometimes engaged and sometimes simply washed over in waves of words that had to be pretended to understand. Some teachers are remembered with fondness, those rare individuals who saw beyond the role of student to the person inhabiting it, who offered encouragement or patience or simply recognition that each child was a unique being worthy of attention and respect. Others are remembered less warmly, those who wielded authority without wisdom, who confused control with teaching, who left wounds that took years to heal or scars that remain still. The social landscape of school is remembered too, those complex hierarchies of belonging and exclusion, the desperate desire to fit in mixed with the equally desperate desire to be recognized as special, the fear of standing out in the wrong ways and the frustration of not standing out in the right ways. There were small victories that felt enormous at the time, making a team or getting a good grade or being included in some social configuration that mattered for reasons that made sense then even if they seem trivial now. And there were failures, quiet or public, that brought shame or disappointment, that felt like definitive judgments on worth or capability, that were survived but not without cost. All of it was part of learning not just the official curriculum of math and history and science but the hidden curriculum of how to exist in social space, how to read situations and people, how to protect oneself and when to trust, how to navigate the complex web of human interaction that would only grow more complex in the years ahead. The self was being formed in those years, identity being constructed out of experiences and reactions and the feedback received from the world, and while much of that construction would be revised and rebuilt in later years, the foundation laid in childhood and school years remained, for better or worse, the ground floor upon which everything else was built. Youth brought a particular kind of energy that is difficult to remember accurately from this distance, a physical vitality and mental quickness that felt normal at the time but which from this vantage point seems almost miraculous, almost impossible to believe that the body and mind once functioned at that level of efficiency and power. There was so much energy that seemed unlimited, that could be expended lavishly without concern for conservation or recovery, that allowed for long days and late nights without consequence, that powered both work and play with equal vigor. The body was strong and quick and reliable, capable of physical feats that now would be unthinkable, taking for granted abilities that would later be lost or diminished, never imagining that these capabilities were temporary, that they represented a peak that would eventually be reached and then descended from. Sleep in youth was different, easy and deep and restorative, the body dropping into unconsciousness as soon as horizontal and not emerging until rested, not this negotiated dance between tiredness and wakefulness that characterizes sleep in later years. There was so little awareness then of limitation, so much confidence in the body's ability to do whatever was asked of it, and that confidence was not misplaced. The body could do what was asked, and so the relationship with the physical self was one of trust and ease rather than the caution and negotiation that would come later. The future in youth felt infinite, stretching out endlessly in all directions, full of possibility and promise, as if there were unlimited time to do everything, to become everything, to experience everything. There was no visceral sense of mortality, no real understanding that time was finite and choices had consequences and paths taken meant other paths could not be taken. Death was something that happened to old people, and old was so far away it might as well have been another planet, not something to consider or plan for or even acknowledge as a reality that would eventually arrive. This lack of foresight was both blessing and curse, allowing for boldness and risk-taking and exploration that might not have happened if the true stakes had been understood, but also allowing for foolishness and waste and damage that more awareness might have prevented. Youth operated on the assumption of unlimited resources, unlimited time, unlimited opportunities for course correction, and while that assumption was false, it was perhaps necessary, perhaps the only way to move forward into adult life without being paralyzed by the weight of decision and consequence. Looking back now, There is something both beautiful and tragic about that youthful innocence, that confident ignorance, that energy moving forward without full knowledge of where it was going or what it would cost to get there. The first real choices of adult life arrived when the self was barely formed, when the identity that would have to live with the consequences of those choices was still in the process of becoming, still uncertain of its own contours and capabilities. The choice of career or education or training, made in late teens or early 20s when the brain was still developing and experience was minimal and the future was impossible to imagine accurately. What to study, what work to pursue, what path to take into the world of adult responsibility and earning and contribution, these decisions felt enormous and were enormous, shaping decades of daily life, determining where time and energy would be spent, influencing who would be met and what opportunities would arise and what kind of life would be possible. And yet they had to be made with insufficient information, based on limited self-knowledge and incomplete understanding of what various choices would actually entail, influenced by pressures from family or society or economic necessity that sometimes pushed in directions that did not align with deeper inclinations or talents or desires. Some choices turned out well, led to satisfaction and success and the building of skills and identity that felt authentic and rewarding. Others were revealed over time to be misdirections, paths that led to dissatisfaction or struggle or the slow realization that a wrong turn had been taken years ago and now correcting course would be difficult or impossible. The choice of relationship, of partner, of whether to commit to another person and build a shared life or remain independent and follow a solitary path, this too was made when young, when understanding of oneself and others was still developing, when the full implications of such commitment could not possibly be grasped. Attraction and chemistry and the feeling of falling in love provided the initial impulse, but building a life together required so much more than initial attraction, required compatibility and commitment and the willingness to grow together rather than apart, to navigate inevitable conflicts and disappointments and the slow revelation of each person's flaws and limitations. Some relationships survived these challenges and grew stronger through them, became partnerships that sustained through decades despite difficulties. Others revealed themselves to be mismatches, based on illusion or need rather than genuine compatibility, and either ended in separation or continued in forms that were more endurance than joy, more habit than choice. Looking back now, it is possible to see how young and unprepared that earlier self was for the magnitude of these choices, and yet they had to be made. There was no way to wait until wisdom arrived because wisdom only arrives through experience and experience requires choices to be made and lived through. Love remembered from the distance of decades takes on particular qualities, softened by time, refined by hindsight, stripped of the intensity that made it feel overwhelming in the moment but which also obscured clear seeing. The early days of romance come back in fragments, the excitement and nervousness and obsessive quality of new attraction. The way everything else seemed to fade into background and only this person, this connection, seemed to matter. The discovery of another person, their particularities and quirks, the slow revelation of who they were beneath the surface they presented, the building of intimacy through shared experience and conversation and vulnerability. If the relationship lasted, if it evolved into long-term partnership, there was the transition from romance to companionship, from excitement to comfort, from intensity to steadiness. The passion that marked the beginning gave way to something less dramatic but perhaps more durable, a love based not on idealization but on genuine knowing, not on perfection but on acceptance of imperfection, not on constant excitement but on reliable presence. The physical expression of love changed over time, from urgency to tenderness, from frequent to occasional, from the center of the relationship to one element among many, and this change brought both loss and gain, the loss of a particular kind of intensity but the gain of other kinds of intimacy, other ways of being close that did not depend on physical capability or desire. The work of long partnership revealed itself over years, the daily negotiations and compromises, the balancing of individual needs with shared needs, the navigation of differences in temperament and preference and habit. There was conflict, inevitable and sometimes painful, moments when it seemed the relationship could not survive the weight of disappointment or anger or fundamental incompatibility. But there was also repair, the work of coming back together after pulling apart, of choosing connection over correctness, of valuing the relationship more than winning the argument or being proven right. Over time patterns emerged, ways of being together that became established routines, comfortable or confining depending on the day and the mood. There were inside jokes and shared references that meant nothing to anyone else but everything within the relationship, a private language built over years of shared experience. There was the silent understanding that developed, the ability to communicate without words, to know from a look or a tone what the other was feeling or needing, to function as a unit that had its own identity beyond the sum of its parts. And if the partnership was sustained until one partner died, there was the experience of losing not just a person but a way of being, a shared life that ended and left the survivor to figure out how to exist as an individual again after decades of existing as half of a pair. Parenting, if children were part of the life lived, brought challenges and satisfactions unlike anything else. A responsibility so enormous it seemed impossible to bear and yet was borne day after day, year after year, through the long decades of active child rearing. The fear of failing them was constant. The awareness that these small beings were completely dependent on care that might prove inadequate, that mistakes made in their raising could damage them in ways that would last a lifetime, that there was no training or preparation sufficient for the task and yet the task had to be performed anyway. Every decision felt weighted with significance. Every choice about discipline or education or what to allow or forbid seemed to carry potential for either benefit or harm, and there was no way to know which choices were which until years later when the consequences revealed themselves. The sacrifice was real and sustained, not dramatic sacrifice of life or limb but the daily sacrifice of time and energy and autonomy and resources, the putting aside of personal desires and ambitions to meet the endless needs of children who could not yet meet their own needs. Sleep was disrupted for years, privacy was lost, spontaneity became difficult or impossible, the relationship with partner was strained by the demands of parenting, individual identity sometimes got lost in the all-consuming role of mother or father. And yet there was pride in watching them grow, in seeing the helpless infants become children and then teenagers and then adults, in witnessing the emergence of personality and capability and independence. There was joy in their joys, pain in their pains, the peculiar experience of having one's emotional life tied to another person's experience in ways that were both beautiful and terrible. The letting go was gradual and difficult, the slow release of control as they needed less and less direct care, the stepping back to allow them to make their own mistakes and learn their own lessons, the acceptance that they were separate people who would make choices different from the choices one would make for them, who would live lives that were theirs and not extensions of parental will or desire. And when they finally left, when the house that had been organized around their presence became empty of them, there was the strange mixture of relief and loss, the freedom to reclaim time and space mixed with the grief of a role that had defined identity for decades coming to an end. The relationship with adult children is different from the relationship with young children, more mutual but also more distant, marked by the separateness that is necessary and healthy but which still sometimes feels like rejection or abandonment even when it is neither. The empty rooms left behind when children leave carry memories in their very emptiness, spaces that were filled with noise and activity and life now quiet and still, cleaned and organized in ways they never were when occupied. The bedroom that was a child's domain for years becomes a guest room or storage space or simply stays as it was, a shrine to a past that cannot be returned to, preserved not because preservation serves any purpose but because changing it feels like erasing something important. The house itself feels different without children in it, larger and quieter and less purposeful, organized around the needs and schedules of only one or two adults rather than the complex coordination required when children were present. There is more time now, time that stretches out without the constant demands that filled every hour when children were young, and that time is both gift and burden, opportunity and emptiness, freedom and loss of direction. Identity has to be reconstructed, a self has to be recovered or created that exists apart from the role of parent, and this work is harder than expected, revealing how much of the self had been absorbed into that role, how little had been preserved or developed outside it. There is grief in this transition even when there is also relief, grief for the years that are over and cannot be recovered, for the children who existed at various ages and are gone now even though the adults they became are still present, for the version of self that existed in relationship to those children and who must now be retired or transformed into something else. The relationship with adult children brings its own challenges and satisfactions, different from the clear hierarchy of parent and young child, more mutual and more complicated, marked by the need to respect boundaries while maintaining connection, to offer support without interfering, to be available without being intrusive. There is pride when they succeed and worry when they struggle, the same emotions that characterized earlier years but now without the ability to directly intervene or control outcomes. There is the strange experience of seeing them become parents themselves if that happens, of watching them navigate the same challenges that were navigated a generation earlier, of seeing patterns repeat and wanting to warn or advise but knowing that learning has to happen through experience, not through being told. The grandchildren, if they come, bring a different kind of love, less weighted with responsibility, more purely joyful because the burden of raising them belongs to someone else, because the role is to delight and spoil and then return them to their parents rather than to shape and discipline and worry constantly about their development and future. Regrets surface in twilight reflection, not with the harsh judgment they might carry in daylight but softened by the gentleness that night brings, acknowledged without being dwelt upon, recognized as part of the story without being allowed to dominate it. There are the words that were never spoken, apologies that should have been offered but were not, expressions of love or appreciation that were felt but never voiced because pride or fear or simple inarticulateness got in the way. There are the moments when presence was needed and not given, when work or distraction or selfishness prevented showing up for someone who deserved better, when the easier choice was made instead of the right choice and someone was left unsupported or unwitnessed in their struggle. There are the opportunities that were not taken, the risks that were not risked, the dreams that were abandoned too easily in favor of security or convention or what others expected. Some regrets are small, barely worth the emotional energy they consume, forgotten birthdays or missed calls or minor unkindnesses that probably meant less to their recipients than they mean in memory. Others are larger, more substantial, choices that shaped years or decades in ways that cannot be undone, relationships that were damaged beyond repair, potentials that were never fulfilled because courage was lacking or circumstances were difficult or the path not taken seemed too uncertain to risk. But from this twilight perspective, even regrets can be held with compassion, seen in context of the person who made those choices, understood as products of limitation rather than pure character failure. The words were not spoken because the skill or confidence to speak them had not been developed, because models for that kind of communication were absent, because vulnerability felt too dangerous in circumstances where safety was not assured. Presence was not given because bandwidth was genuinely insufficient, because the demands being juggled were overwhelming, because there simply was not enough of self to go around and choices had to be made about where to direct limited resources. Opportunities were not taken because the risks were real, not imaginary, because failure was a genuine possibility, because responsibilities to others limited what could be risked, because the fear was proportionate to actual stakes even if in hindsight it seems it should have been overcome. This understanding does not erase the regret, does not make the harm done or the opportunities lost matter less, but it contextualizes them, makes it possible to hold them without being crushed by them, to integrate them into the larger story of a life rather than allowing them to define or dominate that story. Forgiveness, the kind that really matters, happens quietly in moments like this, when the harsh judge softens enough to allow space for the reality that being human means being limited, being flawed, making mistakes, causing harm despite good intentions, and that none of this means the life was wasted or worthless or unforgivable. Forgiveness extends outward as well as inward in these quiet hours, releasing old resentments that have been carried for years, letting go of anger at people who caused harm or disappointment, recognizing that they too were limited and flawed and doing their best with what they had or failing to do their best because they lacked what was needed to do better. Parents who were not the parents that were needed, who were distant or critical or simply absent in important ways, they were themselves shaped by their own wounds and limitations, products of their own difficult childhoods and limited resources and the particular constraints of their time and place. Partners who failed to meet needs, who were unfaithful or unkind or simply unable to provide the support or understanding that the relationship required, they were struggling with their own fears and inadequacies, acting out of their own pain in ways that created pain for others. Friends who betrayed or abandoned, colleagues who competed instead of collaborated, authority figures who abused power or simply failed to use it wisely, all of them were human, all of them were limited, all of them were navigating circumstances that may not be fully knowable from the outside. This recognition does not excuse the harm or make it acceptable, does not mean boundaries should not have been set or that leaving situations or relationships was not sometimes the right choice. But it allows for release of the ongoing anger, the rehearsed resentment, the story of victimization that might be true in its facts but which becomes a prison if it is the only story, if it is the lens through which the whole life is viewed. Choosing peace over being right, choosing release over holding on, choosing to let the past be past rather than continuing to drag it into every present moment, these choices become possible when the ego softens, when the need to protect self-image and maintain narrative gives way to the deeper need for peace, for rest, for the simplicity that comes from putting down heavy burdens and walking forward lighter. And the ultimate forgiveness, the hardest and most necessary, is the forgiveness of self, the letting go of the harsh judgment that has been carried internally, the voice that catalogued every failure and mistake and inadequacy and used them as evidence that the self was fundamentally flawed or worthless or undeserving of love or happiness. That voice, that internal judge, can be thanked for its service in trying to protect and improve, and then it can be gently set aside, recognized as no longer needed, its methods understood as causing more harm than good, its verdicts rejected as too harsh and too simple and missing too much context to be accurate or fair. What remains when that voice quiets is not uncritical acceptance of everything but rather a more balanced view, one that can acknowledge both strength and weakness, both success and failure, both harm done and harm received, and hold all of it as part of the complex reality of a human life that was lived as well as possible given the circumstances and limitations that shaped it. Loss and absence sit quietly in the corner of awareness during these twilight hours, not demanding attention but impossible to ignore, a presence that has become part of the landscape of life at this age when so many who were part of the world are no longer in it. Parents gone now for years or decades, their absence so old it has become normal, but their presence in memory still vivid, still capable of evoking emotion, still influencing choices and thoughts in ways both conscious and unconscious. Siblings who have died, taking with them the only other people who shared childhood, who knew the parents as children knew them, who remembered the same events even if they remembered them differently, who carried the same family history and who, in dying, made that history more solitary, less corroborated, more vulnerable to being lost when the last sibling goes. Friends from various life stages who have died or simply drifted away, their current status unknown, existing somewhere in the world or not existing anymore, but either way no longer part of daily or even occasional life, no longer available for the connection that once seemed so important and permanent. Colleagues and acquaintances and neighbors and the various other people who populated daily existence at different times but who are gone now, moved or retired or died, leaving gaps that sometimes get filled by new people but often simply remain as gaps, as spaces that belong to the past. And if a partner has been lost to death, that absence is its own particular kind of presence, larger and heavier than other losses, changing everything about daily life, about how the home feels and how time is structured and what the future looks like. The routines that were built for two now have to be modified for one, or abandoned altogether because performing them alone emphasizes the absence too painfully. The conversations that were daily habit now happen only internally, imagining what they would say, asking their opinion on decisions even though no answer can come except the answer imagination supplies. The bed is too large, the house is too quiet, the future is too empty, and yet life continues, time passes, adjustment happens whether wanted or not because the loss matters less but because the human organism is designed for survival, for adaptation, for continuing even when continuing seems impossible. Grief evolves over time, the sharp acute pain of fresh loss giving way to chronic ache of long loss, the constant awareness fading to intermittent awareness, the inability to function giving way to ability to function alongside the loss rather than pretending it does not exist. Love does not end when the person dies, it continues in different form, no longer expressed through interaction and care but carried internally, a presence in memory and heart, an influence on choices and thoughts, a lens through which the world is still viewed even though the person through whom that lens was created is no longer here to look through it together. Health and time and the slowing pace of life have become daily realities that cannot be ignored, the body's limitations asserting themselves more insistently with each passing year, demanding attention and accommodation that youth never required. The doctor's appointments multiply on the calendar, Annual checkups supplemented by specialists and follow-ups and screenings that become more frequent as the years advance and the risks of various conditions increase. The medications accumulate, organized in daily or weekly pill containers, a rainbow of tablets and capsules each addressing some particular issue, some breakdown in the body's systems that requires pharmaceutical support. The list of activities that require caution or assistance grows longer, the list of things that can be done without thought or difficulty grows shorter, and this exchange happens gradually enough that adjustment is possible but dramatically enough that the accumulation of changes becomes undeniable. There is negotiation now with the body, a checking in before attempting certain tasks, a recognition that what was possible yesterday might not be possible today, that energy is finite and must be rationed, that rest is not optional but necessary, that ignoring the body's signals leads to consequences that are harder to recover from than they used to be. Time itself has become tangible, no longer the abstract infinite expanse of youth but something that can be felt running out, that can be measured in remaining years rather than in years already lived, that creates urgency about some things and release from urgency about others. The future is shorter now than the past, this is mathematical fact, and that fact changes how choices are made, what seems important, what seems worth energy and attention and what seems better left alone. There is less patience for things that do not matter, less willingness to spend time on obligations that bring no joy or meaning, more clarity about what truly matters and more courage to focus on those things even if it means disappointing others or failing to meet expectations. But there is also acceptance of the pace that is possible now, recognition that rushing accomplishes little except exhaustion, that the slower pace is not failure but reality, that there is dignity in moving at the speed that the body can move rather than trying to force it to move faster. Time becomes precious not in the frantic way of trying to cram more into each moment but in the spacious way of being more fully present to each moment, of noticing and appreciating what is here rather than always reaching for what is next or regretting what was past. Living through history, witnessing the enormous changes that have unfolded over 6 or 7 or 8 decades, provides perspective that younger people cannot have, a sense of how much can change and how quickly or slowly change happens, how patterns repeat and how new problems emerge that have no precedent. The world of childhood seems almost unrecognizable now, a place where technology was simpler or barely existed, where communication was slower and required more effort, where information was scarce and entertainment was limited and people were more rooted in place because mobility was harder and more expensive. The introduction of television and computers and the internet and smartphones, each one changing not just what was possible but how people thought and related and understood themselves and the world. The social changes witnessed over decades, movements for civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and environmental protection, some successful in shifting law and culture and others still struggling, the slow expansion of who is included and who has power and voice, and also the resistance to that expansion, the backlash and the fear that animates it. The economic changes that have shaped what kind of life is possible for different generations, the opportunities that existed once but disappeared, the new opportunities that emerged but required different skills or credentials, the growing inequality that made some lives easier and others harder. Living through these changes, being shaped by them while also witnessing them, creates a doubled perspective, both inside and outside the flow of history, both affected by the currents and able to see the currents from a position that spans decades. The younger self who lived through earlier eras did not always understand the significance of what was happening, did not have the perspective to see how moments of historical importance would be remembered or what their long-term effects would be. Only now, from this vantage point, does the pattern become clearer, the connections between events more visible, the consequences more fully revealed. And this perspective brings both wisdom and weariness, wisdom from understanding how change works and weariness from seeing the same problems recur, the same mistakes get made by new generations who believe they are encountering these problems for the first time, the slow and frustrating pace at which real progress happens when it happens at all. What truly mattered, what rises to the surface when everything else is stripped away, was simpler than it seemed during the years of striving and achieving and building and accumulating. Relationships mattered, the people who were loved and who returned that love, the connections that were nurtured and maintained even when maintenance was difficult, the web of family and friendship and partnership that provided meaning and support and the sense of being part of something larger than the individual self. Time mattered, how it was spent, whether it was spent on things that brought satisfaction or meaning or joy, or whether it was squandered on things that ultimately proved empty or meaningless. Presence mattered, being actually here rather than distracted or planning ahead or regretting the past, being available to experience and to other people, being engaged with life as it unfolded rather than always being somewhere else mentally or emotionally. Status and wealth and achievement, the things that consumed so much energy and worry, proved to matter less than expected, to bring less satisfaction than promised, to be empty accomplishments if they came at the cost of relationship or presence or personal integrity. This is not to say they did not matter at all. Money provided security and comfort. Achievement provided satisfaction and identity. Status provided access and influence. But they were not sufficient. They did not provide meaning or happiness in themselves. They were tools or means but not ends, and mistaking them for ends led to emptiness and regret. Knowing this now does not erase the years spent in that mistaken pursuit, does not give back the time that was spent climbing ladders that led nowhere important, but it does provide clarity for whatever time remains, permission to focus on what actually matters, courage to let go of what does not. Simplicity becomes the goal, not the enforced simplicity of poverty or lack, but the chosen simplicity of knowing what is enough, what is sufficient, what actually contributes to well-being and peace. Less becomes more in this equation. Less striving means more presence. Less accumulation means more space. Less obligation means more freedom. Less performance means more authenticity. The complicated life that was built over decades of addition can be simplified in these final chapters through subtraction, through letting go, through saying no, through choosing only what truly serves the life that is wanted in these remaining years. Letting go of control, releasing the illusion that outcomes can be forced through effort and will, accepting that so much is beyond individual power and that trying to control what cannot be controlled only leads to suffering. This has been one of the hardest lessons of a long life, but also one of the most freeing. Control was always illusion. This is clear now, even if it was not clear before. The feeling of control was just feeling. The reality was always that circumstances were shaped by forces larger and more numerous than individual will, that luck and timing and the actions of others and impersonal systems all influenced outcomes in ways that individual effort could not determine. Children made their own choices no matter how much guidance was offered or how perfect the parenting tried to be. Careers took turns that were not planned. Companies failed or succeeded based on market forces and decisions made elsewhere. Relationships evolved or dissolved according to dynamics that were only partially controllable by any individual within them. Health followed its own trajectory, influenced but not determined by choices about diet and exercise and medical care. Letting go of the illusion of control does not mean becoming passive or stopping all effort, but it means right-sizing effort, directing it where it might actually make a difference and releasing it where it will not, accepting outcomes that cannot be changed and adapting to them rather than exhausting oneself fighting reality. This letting go brings peace, a lightness that comes from putting down the enormous burden of believing that everything depends on personal effort, that every outcome is the result of whether enough was done or done well enough. Some things are simply beyond control, and that is not failure, that is just reality, and accepting reality is the only path to peace. Flexibility becomes more valuable than rigidity, the ability to adapt to circumstances rather than insisting circumstances adapt to intention. Acceptance becomes more valuable than resistance, the ability to work with what is rather than fighting for what is not. Surrender becomes wisdom rather than defeat, the recognition that some battles cannot be won and that continuing to fight them wastes resources that could be used elsewhere, that could be used for adaptation or for finding alternate paths toward goals or for revising goals to align with what is actually possible rather than what was wished for. The need to be right, to have the last word, to win arguments and prove points, this need diminishes as the ego softens, as the identity becomes less fragile and less dependent on external validation, as the inner knowing becomes more important than outer approval. Peace becomes more valuable than correctness, connection becomes more valuable than winning, and choices shift accordingly. The twilight has deepened now into true night, the last traces of daylight gone from the sky beyond the windows, darkness complete except for whatever artificial lights remain on in the house or shine from street lamps outside. The world has settled fully into nighttime mode, traffic sounds diminished to rare occurrences, voices outside silenced, Even the birds quiet now except for the occasional night bird whose call carries across the darkness. The house itself seems to be sleeping or at least resting, its daytime activity concluded, its systems running quietly, maintaining but not producing. The temperature has dropped, the air cooler now against the skin, requiring blankets or warmth from the bed itself, the body's own heat captured and reflected back. The mind begins to follow the body's lead, begins to slow, the thoughts that have been flowing steadily since twilight started to thin out, to come less frequently, to lose their urgency and weight. The review that has occupied these hours approaches completion not because everything has been remembered or processed or resolved but because the mind tires, because attention cannot be sustained indefinitely, because sleep asserts its claim more insistently as the night progresses. Breathing slows, deepens, becomes more regular, the body's system shifting into nighttime mode, preparing for rest and repair and restoration. Muscles that have been tense begin to release, shoulders dropping away from ears, jaw unclenching, hands uncurling, legs stretching out and then settling into comfortable position. The weight of the body presses into the mattress, every point of contact registering, the support of the bed beneath becoming more noticeable as consciousness of the body increases in that particular way that happens on the edge of sleep when external awareness fades and internal awareness briefly intensifies before fading as well. The pillow cradles the head, cool at first and then warming, shaped by pressure into exactly the right configuration for comfort. The blankets settle over the body, their weight providing gentle pressure that signals safety, that helps the nervous system recognize that it is okay to let go, okay to stop vigilance, okay to allow consciousness to dim. The thoughts that have been flowing begin to fragment, to lose their narrative quality, to become more dreamlike, images and sensations without the connecting logic that makes them meaningful. And this fragmentation is not disturbing but welcome, a sign that sleep is approaching, that the border between waking and sleeping is being crossed. The twilight that began hours ago has completed its work, has transitioned fully from the gentle ending of day to the deep night that allows for sleep, for dreams, for the restoration that comes from true rest. The review of life that filled those hours, the memories and reflections and recognitions that surfaced, these have served their purpose, have allowed for integration and acceptance and the gentle forgiveness that night makes possible. There is no need to solve anything, to fix anything, to resolve anything completely. The life was lived as it was lived, is what it is, and from this perspective, from this bed in this darkness at this age, it is enough. The striving can stop, the judgment can be set aside, the harsh assessment can be replaced with gentle acknowledgement that a human life was lived with all the complexity and contradiction and imperfection that human lives contain, and that this is not failure, this is just reality, and reality accepted brings peace. The gift that comes with this acceptance is the recognition that enough has been done, enough has been given, enough has been tried, not in a dismissive or minimizing way but in a deeply honest and gentle accounting, a clear-eyed understanding that a life is not meant to be measured by perfection or completion but by participation, by presence, by the willingness to show up again and again despite uncertainty and fear and fatigue, and that what remains now is not more doing but more being, not more striving but more resting, not more proving but more accepting, a soft turning away from the endless question of whether it was sufficient and toward the quieter truth that it was. The life was sufficient, the effort was adequate, the love was real even if imperfect and sometimes clumsy and sometimes misunderstood, the contribution was made even if it was not recognized or celebrated, even if it passed quietly into the world without applause or record, and all of this adds up to enough, adds up to a life that has earned its rest, that has earned the peace that comes from releasing the burden of constant evaluation and simply allowing what was to be what was. There is relief in this realization, a loosening of the tight internal grip that insisted on comparison and justification, that demanded evidence and results, that feared insignificance and invisibility, and with that relief comes a spaciousness where judgment once lived. Memory softens here, sharp regrets losing their edges, proud moments no longer needing to be defended, failures no longer requiring explanation, all of them settling into the same broad category of experience, of learning, of being human. The narrative of the self, once so carefully maintained and revised, no longer needs to be coherent or impressive, it only needs to be true enough, real enough, held with kindness instead of critique. There is gratitude, perhaps not articulated but present nonetheless. Gratitude that hums beneath thought rather than sitting neatly in words. Gratitude for having lived, for having loved, for having been part of the great human story, even if only as one small thread in an enormous tapestry. One brief note in a song that has been playing for millennia and will continue after this individual voice falls silent. Gratitude for ordinary days as much as extraordinary ones, for routines and repetitions that once felt dull but now reveal themselves as structure and shelter, for relationships that shaped and challenged and comforted, even the difficult ones that left marks, because they too were part of the shaping. There is gratitude for the body that carried this life through years and seasons, that bore stress and illness and pleasure and touch, for the senses that allowed the world to be experienced directly, light and sound and texture and taste, all of it fleeting but real while it lasted. There is gratitude for moments of connection that broke through loneliness, for laughter that surprised its way out in dark times, for small kindnesses given and received that may have seemed insignificant at the time but accumulated quietly into something meaningful. In this acceptance there is also forgiveness, not dramatic or ceremonial but practical and necessary, forgiveness of the self for not knowing what could only be known later, for choices made with limited information and limited capacity, for pauses that were mistaken for failures and detours that were mistaken for waste. Forgiveness extends outward too, to others who were also doing the best they could with what they had, whose actions caused harm not always from malice but from their own confusion and fear, and releasing that weight frees energy that was long spent holding on to grievance. What remains is a sense of completion that does not require finality, a wholeness that does not depend on everything having gone well, only on having been lived fully enough, honestly enough, with attention and care when possible. The constant push toward improvement gives way to a quieter appreciation of what already is and what already was, and in that space there is room for gentleness, for stillness, for simply inhabiting the moment without the need to justify its existence. Acceptance does not erase pain or loss, but it reframes them as part of the same fabric as joy and success, threads that give depth and contrast to the overall pattern, making it richer rather than lesser. There is a sense of standing back and seeing the life not as a list of achievements or failures but as a whole landscape, uneven and complex and unmistakably human, worthy of respect simply because it was lived. In recognizing this, the need to add more chapters, to rewrite endings, to chase validation, gradually dissolves, replaced by a calm acknowledgement that the story as it stands is complete enough. The gift is not the absence of longing but the absence of desperation, not the claim that nothing more could ever be desired but the peace of knowing that nothing more is required to make the life count. And within that knowing there is a quiet dignity, a deep exhale, a settling into the truth that being here, trying, caring, and continuing for as long as one could was itself the point, and that this, in all its imperfection and sincerity, is enough. The body is ready now, has been ready for hours, muscles softened and breath slowed and the small aches of the day settling into something manageable, and finally the mind releases its grip on wakefulness, releases the need to think and remember and process and analyze, releases the endless commentary and the quiet anxieties and the mental list that insisted on being checked and rechecked, allows the consciousness that has been running since morning to finally power down, to loosen its hold, and drift instead of drive. Sleep comes not as dramatic event but as gradual transition, a fading rather than a shutting off, a dimming rather than a darkness, awareness thinning like mist at dawn, becoming less sharp and then less present and then barely there and then gone, the border crossed without even noticing the crossing, without a clear moment to point to and say this was it, this was when day ended and night truly began. The room remains the same and yet not the same, familiar shapes losing their edges, the ceiling no longer something to look at but something that simply exists above, the sounds of the world outside either dissolving into background or becoming strangely amplified and then dissolving too as attention loosens and slips. Dreams may come or may not come, may arrive gently or burst in with sudden color and motion, the mind turning scraps of memory and emotion into stories, into symbols, into scenes that make sense only while they are happening, and the night may be filled with vivid narratives or with blank restoration, a deep dark pool where nothing is remembered and nothing needs to be, and either is fine, either serves the purpose of rest, either allows the body and mind to do the work they need to do in the absence of conscious direction. In this state the rules change, time stretches and folds in on itself, minutes pass unnoticed or hours collapse into a single instant, and the self that worried and planned and reacted all day loosens into something quieter and less defined, a presence without demands. The heart keeps its steady rhythm, lungs rise and fall, cells repair and replenish, systems hum along performing tasks that never require permission, never require thought, only the space to do what they have always done. Thoughts still flicker at the edges at first, fragments of conversations, half-formed ideas, images from the day replaying without context, but they too lose their urgency and slide away, each one a little less compelling than the last, until even the impulse to follow them fades. There is comfort in this surrender, in trusting the process, in letting go of the illusion that constant attention is necessary for survival, that everything will fall apart if the mind stops watching for a while. Tomorrow, if it comes, will bring its own challenges and joys, will require waking and rising and returning to the world of activity and relationship and responsibility, will ask for decisions and effort and presence. But that is tomorrow's concern, not tonight's, and tonight there is only this darkness, this bed, this rest, this pause in the long ongoing motion of living. Tonight there is permission to stop striving, to stop performing, to stop being productive, permission to exist without purpose beyond recovery, to sink into the simple fact of being alive and safe enough to sleep. The sheets hold warmth, the mattress supports weight, gravity does its quiet work, and the mind, no longer clinging to its role as narrator and manager, drifts further from the surface. Even the sense of self becomes softer, boundaries blur, the line between body and space less distinct, until there is just sensation without commentary, and then even that fades. Whatever the night holds, whether dreams arrive with strange logic or whether consciousness simply disappears into a deep unmarked stretch, it is enough, it is what is needed, it is part of the rhythm that carries life forward without asking for understanding. Morning will return when it returns, light will find its way back into the room, the mind will reassemble itself and reach again for language and intention, but for now none of that matters, and the last thing to dissolve is the quiet acceptance of this moment, the relief of not having to do anything at all, as sleep fully takes over and the day finally, completely, lets go. You've journeyed far through time tonight. Now it's time to journey into dreams. Close your eyes, breathe, and let sleep find you.